Okay. Well, welcome. And so we're going to be moving from the first lecture series that we've covered was looking at vegetation sampling. A little bit ad nauseum, but I think you kind of get the idea of why sampling vegetation and all the different methods and being able to understand those different methods is important. We're moving into the slightly more interesting realm now of actual ecology. And specifically, we're going to be looking at how species interact with the environment. And the next lecture series, we're going to be looking at how species interact amongst each other. Okay? But this lecture series is looking at the environmental complex. Again, this is taken from Barber, Burke, and Pitts, so those chapters are available already. And we're going to be looking at a number of sections. You know, some basic concepts, what exactly the environmental factors are, and then also, because you've covered this in your previous module, you've covered this taxonomic idea, you know, what is a species, etc. But there's also something called an ecological species, and how ecological species and taxonomic species are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, so moving on to backgrounds and basic concepts. Just in terms of the history of ecology, it's a fairly recent field. I mean, if you think about ecology, it's the fundamentals of understanding how ecosystems, how nature works. I mean, the term ecosystem is probably not, it's only been around for 50, 60 years, which is quite a scary fact if you think that it's a fairly recent phenomenon that we realize is foundational to managing our planet. So, you know, ecology has been around informally for hundreds of years. Any of you familiar with Humboldt, Alexander Humboldt? So he was an explorer who went down the Americas by ship, and he was one of the first people to identify the gradients of biodiversity. Tropics are richer than as you move towards the poles. Quite a fundamental observation to make from a ship, you know, or doing multiple landings as you move away from the equator. And then all the way through to Darwin. There have been many geographers and natural historians who've kind of tinkered with ecology. And the first kind of form of ecology, the first kind of term that maybe we need to package this into its own field, was first termed by a German, Ernst Haeckel, who called it ecology. So actually we should be, this little OE merge thing is actually an oo sound, so just a grammatical thing there, that if we were following the actual true origins of ecology, we should be calling it ecology. So that's about 150 years ago. But, let me just go. The first ecological societies where this was actually became a field were established in about 1920s, 1930s. That's actually when ecology became a recognized field where there were journals that you could publish in. Interestingly enough, the roots of ecology are on limnology, study of lakes, and then it's kind of there was a large enough cohort of people to form. Just hang on one moment. It was a large enough group of people to actually start forming these organizations, and then it expanded from there. So, you know, the powers of ecology helps us to understand, you know, to answer some questions. So, we want to know how species, communities, populations are going to react in the natural environment to a whole bunch of different changes, whether in the past or in the future. And we want to know, plants have to solve issues of environmental change. Animals can get up and move. You know, if there's an expanding ice sheet, or if it's becoming drier, or whatever, you know, animals can migrate fairly easily. Plants can only migrate across generations. They can only migrate by seed. Okay? So an individual plant has to sit there and has to weather whatever the environmental storm is, whatever the environmental difficulties are. And so the ways that they can solve this, I've already mentioned: dispersal via seeds, so that's intergenerational movement. And then they've got these issues that they have to worry about in terms of actually germinating, surviving, competition. Where do they get their energy and their nutrients from? And can we then ultimately use plants to tell us something about the environment? And quite often we can. Interestingly enough, a lot of geological mapping that's been done in South Africa is not based on looking at the underlying geological parent material, but it's looking at the vegetation communities that are occurring on top. Because there are a number of vegetation communities that are geologically specific, and so geologists have used those vegetation communities. It's not always the case. There are a few instances where you can map large geological units by the vegetation that occurs on them. And then also we're interested about ideas of evolution, and but also ecology is really important for this point. Management. There is no planet B. We have to manage our present planet and make sure that we don't ruin it for ourselves and all the other species that we share it with. And there's a lot that we need to manage. You know, deforestation, overgrazing, loss of topsoil, herbicides. Most recently, I attended a lecture on plastic pollution. Cool. So up in the Pyrenees, so high elevation mountains, no humans anywhere close to them. They are finding more than 60,000 nanoparticles of plastic raining down per square meter per month. So there's plastic, nanoplastics, getting up into our high mountain systems. There are no people there for pollution, for these nanoplastics to get there. How's it doing that? It has to now be part of our circulation system. And that is pretty scary, because plastic hangs onto heavy metals. It's like one of the best pollution absorbers and dispersers. So if you have any, say you have, okay, bit of a side issue here, but say you have a craft beer that has filtered water in it and whatnot, you're probably drinking between 20 and 30 nanoplastic particles, minimum, absolute minimum, in that beer. And you have no idea what's attached to those nanoplastic particles. The other thing about them is that they move in and out of your cell membranes. Nanoplastics just move in and out. That was published in Nature 3 weeks ago. So what effect nanoplastics have on the environment is completely unknown. So we need ecologists who understand these systems, understand them originally, to figure out what's going on. And then also, there seems to be more and more natural disasters. That could be just because there are more people on the planet, so we're more aware of when disasters occur. They affect more people. But there also is very good indications that natural disasters, the frequency of natural disasters, are increasing. Okay, I've been using for the last week and a bit a term very, very loosely: vegetation. Yeah. So let's just give vegetation a quick definition. So the flora is that all the plants that you find in a region, in a community, and it's also, there needs to be some kind of spatial and temporal link between species to make this vegetation. And so a vegetation type, we usually characterize by specific growth forms. So physiognomy, that word again, so you even get tongue-tied. Physiognomy of dominant plants. Now, just remember that normally we think of vegetation as being the flora of a region. So we'll talk about this vegetation on the reserve. But if I talk about a vegetation type, say dune fynbos, the flora here, that species list might be completely different to the same dune fynbos in the Western Cape, say on Table Mountain, on the Table Mountain National Park. As it goes down to the sea, there's a dune flora there. It's very, very different. It doesn't have the same flora list. Okay? So, but that is the same vegetation type. Got the same physiognomy, growth forms, and if you look at the kind of genus and family level, it shows you there. Okay, so just to be sure about those terms. Could someone open up at the back there? So, ecology, definition of ecology, the study of organisms in the environment. And what is the environment? Another term revealed here. Usually, when you think of the environment, it's one usually thinks of the abiotic: soil, temperature, light, nutrients, water, those kind of things. Please be aware, when I use the term, and we use the term in ecology, the environment is everything that an individual would experience. So it's that abiotic, but it's also the biotic, the living component. Yeah? So if you're a blade of grass, part of the environment would be the elephant. Yeah. And then obviously the interactions with the biotic environment and the abiotic environment. That is the biotic component and the abiotic component. That's what I was saying. That is the environment. Okay. And just in terms of, there are two ways to think of the environment, and I'm making a very, very coarse break between them: the macro environment and the micro environment. So the macro environment is prevailing regional conditions, whereas the micro environment is something that's happening locally that affects the environment quite substantially. And one always needs to keep these two kind of concepts in mind, because you might have the same or similar microenvironmental conditions that are hundreds of kilometers apart in different macro environments. In different macro environments. So if we take, okay, you might have the same microenvironmental conditions, or very similar microenvironmental conditions, under different macroenvironmental conditions. Okay, so macroenvironmental conditions might be, if you are, I've used Table Mountain already. So we take, sorry, again, would someone just mind opening the back there? Thank you. So if we take Table Mountain, it occurs in a summer arid system, a Mediterranean climate system, okay? But, and we take maybe the Suurberg in the Eastern Cape, which occurs in a year-round rainfall system. Very different macro environments, if we look at the climate regime. But if you are on a south-facing slope near a seep, for example, so you have year-round rain, year-round water availability from the seep, not due to year-round rain because of those are similar microenvironments. Same light, same water availability, even though the macro environment is different. So one needs to be very, very careful when you go and look at a site and you go, okay, well, we're in the Eastern Cape, or we're in KwaZulu-Natal, and there we've got a summer rainfall system, and so what I'm seeing on the ground is driven by the macro environment. it could be driven by microenvironmental factors. I'm going to show you a video in a moment to show you how microenvironments can change and the effect that it has on vegetation versus under the same macroenvironmental conditions. Okay. I won't play that just yet, I've just got a few more slides I want to show. So the macroenvironment, one way of thinking about it is if you go and put yourself 20 meters above the vegetation canopy. And that's kind of what you experience as the macroenvironment, because of rainfall, the sunlight, the temperature, whether it's cloudy or not. Your microenvironment is, if you're over here, you've got full sunlight, but if you're in the shade of this tree, that affects your microenvironment hugely. You're now shaded, you've got less energy because there's less sunlight coming in. So you'd find light, kind of light-loving plants or plants that need high levels of light versus shade-loving plants or shade-tolerant plants occurring under there. So you always need you've got to get your eye in and thinking about these different, how environment changes at scales. It can even change at the level of one plant. So this is a microenvironment or temperature of an alpine plant, so high elevation, in the sun and shade on a July day, so this is northern hemisphere, this is summer for them. And the macroenvironment, so a weather station like right next door, would say, or the temperature of 20 meters up above this plant was a temperature of 11.7 degrees. So what they then do is they then measure they've measured the temperature of this plant at different times very quickly, and the flower is 15.5 degrees, so it's 4 degrees warmer than the macroenvironment. So the petals, stem 13.3 degrees, the leaves 18, 19 degrees. Obviously they're green, they're dark, they're warming up, they're trapping the heat. And then there's the subsoil, 6.3 degrees, 3.9, all the way down to 1 degree at the bottom of the roots. The soil is still very cold. So these are all microenvironmental conditions that are changing at even a plant level within a plant. Okay, I'm going to ask this Plicker question next week, but I wanted to show you. This. So this is the Balkans, and my mind has just gone blank. So it's the parking lot, and you go, where is this?
Yes. Which parking lot?
Anyway, it's somewhere that most of you have probably been and walked in. It's the lower end of the Balkans. But what I want to show you is north-facing. So this slope is north-facing. North is in this direction. So this is a north-facing slope. That is grassland with a couple of shrubs in it. The exact same angled slope, but south-facing, is very thickety. And when the slopes get very steep south-facing, you get into forest. Okay, so if we look here, we've got grassland, an arid thicket type, it's very succulent rich. We've got a mesic thicket type and forest. And if we were to place ourselves, or a weather balloon, 50 meters up in the air, or quite high in the air here, it's all the same macro environment. Yeah? So all of these vegetation types are being driven by microenvironmental effects. What is the driver here for this microenvironment? Slope and aspect, topography. Okay, so in this case, the microenvironmental effect is topography. And I want to show you this video that I took at Hopewell. No, I don't want to play this one first. I want to play this one. Okay, so here, I'm just going to kill all the lights in the hopes that improves the picture somewhat, and I'm going to restart it. So I'm standing on one side of a valley, and I'm looking, this will be, what direction am I looking at here? I'm probably looking about southwest. This picture is taken facing southwest. That is Lady Slipper. This mountain in the background there is Lady Slipper, if any of you. Okay, so do you notice that vegetation type, different. Can you see the difference in picture there? And here we go back to that vegetation type over there. Do you see there's now a shift in vegetation? Definite shift there. Now Karen watching, this is different to that, eh? That's forest and thicket. Actually, you need to do this a bit slower. There's a slope ridge into a different vegetation type. Look at the forest there. So you can see there's a shift of 1, 2, 3, at least 3 different communities here, very coarsely, that you can just look at physiognomically. Yeah, we're not looking at species here, but there are massive species differences between them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replay the same hand shot, but at a much more zoomed level. Okay, and I'm just going to talk you through what these different vegetation types are. So, this, what do you think this is? What does it look like? Grassland, yeah, okay. With some shrubs. Definite grassland. Look at tall shrubs at least. Tall shrubs. This is an arid thicket. There's speckbroom in here. I went and walked in that patch. So there's some speckbroom in here. North facing. So it gets a lot more sun. With a lot more sun, a lot more evaporation. Growing temperatures are much higher. And with more evaporation and higher temperatures, there's less moisture availability. Okay. Then as we move, do you see that this is a valley here? And here we're shifting it into a different vegetation type. Now we're getting a bit of a repeat. North-facing grassland, a little bit of north-facing, there's more grassland here. This is actually a little bit south-facing, tilting away from the sun a little bit. And so this is getting onto, it's a strong restoid grassland mix with feinbossy shrubs in it. Okay. And so north facing again. And then obviously there are bits where rocky outcrops, which are fire protected, have got thicket clumps on them. Here we go. Here we are. This is the valley, north facing slope, south facing slope. This is all Leucodendron selignum. That yellow. So this is very much a strong feinboss. And then the slope, so the slope gets steeper. So with steepness, increase in moisture, you can see there's a high biomass, high density of plants. and then it becomes really steep, super steep, keeps fire out. So steep that fire battles to get going. And what do you see? South-facing slopes, very cool and moist, but also keeps fire out, and you've got forest. So we've had grassland, arid thicket, fynbos, and effectively forest, all under the same macro environment. But now we've got different micro-environmental conditions. Okay, so, yeah, Christian.
Could you attribute the change to the protolith in the rock?
Very good question. Was there a change in the geology? Some places, it's definitely, there'll be a change there'll be a shift in the geology, and then that'll drive a shift in vegetation. In that case, at least two of those slopes I know are the same geological type. There is one where it becomes a lot steeper. I need to go and check. I never actually got there because it's very unpleasant to walk on very steep slopes. So, but yes, that's a very good point that you need to kind of keep in the back of your mind. An interesting point where I've overlooked geology before is that there was a grassland thicket boundary at a study site that I worked on for about 3 years, which I thought it was a fire-driven boundary. And then one day, after walking over this geological boundary for like the 10th time, did I actually go, hang on, these are completely different, this is a geologically driven boundary, and I just haven't seen it. So you have to kind of carry on looking at these things and carry on interrogating what you think the environmental drivers are. Okay, now moving on to, that's macro and micro environment that you just need to keep in mind. In your previous module, you've spoken a lot about taxonomy and species, and in our vegetation sampling, we've made something important about, we've made important mention of species, but we haven't discussed this issue. So there's a way of subsuming for ecology. We sometimes, depending on your question, the species isn't all that important, but growth forms are more important. Just before I continue, do you want me to turn the lights back on, or are you happy to kind of work in darkness? Is there sufficient light? Sufficient light? Mm-hmm. Okay.
She's asking if it's fine for the video.
Yeah, it's good for the video. Actually, having it dark like that, it's cool. Okay, so growth forms. There could be a lot of different ways of breaking up growth forms, breaking a species up into growth forms. They're a really nice shorthand to be able to describe what a system looks like very easily and quickly. And your growth form definitions can be based on size. That's the most obvious one. Tree versus herb, or graminoid versus tree. Your lifespan, annual versus perennial. Its woodiness, again, herbs and trees. And what it is that it's kind of beyond what your species your species name is. It's beyond taxonomy. The morphology that can be included, and so like whether it's a stem succulent, leaf succulent, whether it's got thorns, something along those lines. You can include leaf traits. So, so these are when leaves are dropped and what the shape of the leaves are, but you can also break it up into like nanophils all the way into megaphils. Phenology is something else that can also go into growth form when different events happen. So do you see that there's a whole bunch of things that you could use to describe growth forms? Again, It's for what question you're interested in. There are a range of different growth form definitions, and some of them might not apply to or assist you in the question that you're wanting to ask. So unfortunately, this is another case of there's no single hammer that solves all problems. Not all problems are nails. This is one very popular system, Ronkier system. I see some nods. Are you familiar with this? Anyone else know the Ronkier system? It's got a lot of jargon in it, unfortunately, so I will cover it again. And so this is the location of the overwintering and perinating parts. So where the growth forms, where are the growth points kept in the off-season, so to speak, the non-growth season. And this is the system that Ronkier developed. And he has phanerophytes. And this is what you would call your trees. So woody perennials where your growth buds are higher than 25 centimeters. And those are all broken up. I mean, 25 centimeters is quite a low threshold to pass. So like most things would be phanerophytes. And they're mega phanerophytes, so those would be your forest trees, your redwoods that grow 10 meters, sometimes hundreds of meters tall. Chemophytes, this is where your budding points are close to the ground but above the ground. So they're in that kind of less than 20. So think of strawberries. They keep their budding systems above the ground. In fact, something like Cercia crenata is probably a better example actually, because strawberries root every time they create an elbow, but Cercia crenata just puts its branches, effectively keeps its branches on the ground as it grows along, and then puts up upwards branches, but it never actually roots. Then there are hemicryptophytes, where the buds are near the surface. Cryptophytes, where your budding points are below the ground. So this is where you've got your geophytes. That's another word you should be familiar with, or term that you should be familiar with. So when you're looking at cryptophytes, make sure you've got geophyte written there. And rhizome bulbs. Just in terms of ecology of cryptophytes, I think that we know almost nothing about what's going on with cryptophytes. We know a lot about phanerophytes. They're easy to study. They're up in the big trees. We can see what's going on above ground. A lot of what's going on is all happening above ground. These cryptophytes are incredibly species rich, and we don't know what's going on in terms of phenology. And I'll just do another segue for a moment. I had a PhD student who was interested in edible foods from different vegetation types. So she had a trained set of harvesters who knew all the edible foods, and they were going to vegetation types and seeing how much food you could actually get. Can you get enough food to live off? And cryptophytes in the fynbos, and a lot of the time are where the bulk of it's at. Think of like your potatoes, it's the wild equivalent of your potatoes. But one of the things that we were interested in is that we're going into environments that haven't had humans foraging on them before, so what are the depletion rates? So how quickly does your patch of potatoes, your wild potatoes, how quickly does that deplete? That's an important question. So she put out a whole array of 10 by 10 plots. She had her foragers go in there. Everything that they could find, they would remove. And the expectation was the next year that we go back, there's nothing there. You've removed it all, so, you've only got like that and that one 10 by 10. So we went back, she went back, The next year, got the same biomass out. So, okay, that's not expected. Went back the third year, got the same biomass out. The species were changing in some cases, so different species were evident, which weren't evident in the previous years. In some cases, it could be the same species, but they bud at different times. So there seems to be, and then there just seem to be some that just aren't accessible. They grow at different depths. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's almost impossible to deplete a 10 by 10 meter plot without just going and plowing it. You plow it, you destroy everything. But if you're trying to be a forager, it's really difficult to. You have to be continuously hammering it, we think, for many years before you get everything out of that plot. Because what we thought when we went in is that during the peak growing season, all individuals, all species would be evident and flowering, and we'd be able to follow that down and get the bulbs. Doesn't seem to be like that in any way. And as far as we can tell, we're the first study that even starts considering these ideas. So what's happening at the cryptophyte level, ecologically-wise, when things are flowering, do they delay their flowering between years, etc., etc., we have no idea about. And that's a bit worrying, because this is when you're doing your carpet modeling and you're trying to understand massive ecological systems and whatnot. These things are pretty important, because there's a hell of a lot of stuff that's going on. There's a lot of biomass that's underground, and yet at the moment in all of our models it's just a question mark. So I've mentioned geophytes. There's helophytes resting in marshy ground, hydrophytes that are submerged underwater, and there are also therophytes. Any plant which survives unfavorable seasons in the form of seeds only, so those are your annuals. Think of the macroland flower display. Quite often, that the primary species that are involved with that flower display are annuals, and so they get through their whole life cycle in one season, produce seeds, and those seeds can stay dormant until the next good rains occur. So just a reminder, so this is just a visual: phanerophytes, chemophytes, hemicryptophytes, cryptophytes. There's a whole different, there's bulbs, rhizomes, there's a whole kind of morphology of what's going on there, going on under there, rather, I should say. Hydrophytes, and then your helophytes as well. So this is just one system. It's used very commonly in the literature, so you kind of do need to know these really bad jargon words. I mean, I think we could come up with much better just standard terminology. We're going to stick with what the literature says. Okay. Again, remember we're still kind of just in the general introduction phase of ecology, so there's specializations within ecology. Ecology. So ecology focuses on the community. So both Gleason and Clement, on the way that they viewed communities and how species were, they were focusing on the community level, and so they were ecologists. And that will include things like dynamics, succession, and response to environment, those kind of things, which also apply, response to environment also applies at autoecology level. So you have synecology, community. Autoecology is where you focus on the species. So it's a life history, you're focusing on the life history of a specific species. So you want to know behaviors of individuals, individual species or populations in relation to their environment. And what's really important for this is population ecology and demography. If populations, if you're interested in a species and you're interested in its expanding or declining, your red data list is you're familiar with the red data list? You know what that is? Okay, red data list tells you, gives you a status of all of our plant species in terms of their level of threat. That's auto-ecological. There is a similar list which is for at the community level of threat. And that would be synecology. That would be synecology. It's much more difficult to do the synecological one than it is to do the horticological. Then there's also ecophysiology and genetics. At a species level, it's difficult to do community level genetics. And if you're doing anything other than microbes or diatoms, if you're trying to do, it doesn't make sense to use genetics. It doesn't make too much sense to use genetics at a community level during fables. And so what goes into plant ecology, plant geography, and natural history were the kind of, those were the fields that kind of formed plant ecology. Those got together, merged, formed plant ecology. Then there are these two major branches, synecology and auticology. And auticology focuses on population, physiology, and evolution. Synecology, community, also works at evolution, but looks at community dynamics and kind of your ecosystem approach. You look at ecosystems, it's a synecology approach. Plant sociology, that's classification of vegetation types, and also kind of paleoecology. Okay, so that was just some basic concepts, some basic history, a general introduction into ecology. And moving on to environmental factors and plant distributions, which is the next section. So, we've already asked this question, but this is one of the fundamentals when we deal with the environment. You want to know what prevents an individual from dying, an individual plant from dying in an environment, or a population from dying in a given environment. What mechanisms do they have to cope? This is, we'll get on to a bit later. And I actually, I throw in ecological species so that you, rather than focusing on a single species as a discrete unit, but to think of the variation within the species, because it's variation which drives natural selection. Okay. Plant growth, more terminology. There appears to be, this should have been a few slides back, there just appears to be a bit of a mix-up with the slides, so you might just want to say, slide 25, there's been a slight mix-up, just so when you're going through the slides you can maybe reorder them the way that you feel, but the content appears to be cohesive. It just seems my slides somehow are out of kilter for some reason. I do apologize. We've got phases of plant growth, and this is just so that you can think of different, remember we spoke about phenology, and so there are different phenological phases. Plants do things at different times. So when does this primary growth, stem elongation, occur? Stem thickness, that's longer than seasons, but leaf and flower development, that's definitely usually within seasons. And what affects this plant growth seems to be, abiotic. It's like, those are the enablers. If you don't have water, you don't have sunlight, you don't have nutrients, you're not going to get growth. So, abiotic, those are the enablers. If you have those three, depending on their abundance, you'll get some plant growth. So, your light, water, nutrient availability, and then also you need something to grow in. You know, It's very important because if you might have all three of these, but you're in a very clay soil that hangs onto its water. So even if there's a lot of water around, it's clays hang onto the water. It's actually very difficult to extract water out of clay. So plants battle. So there could be an effective dehydration effect. So that's why soil and sediment type is also very important. And light and temperature are kind of solar radiation. Those are usually very much linked. And then fire is another crucial thing. Suitable habitat is kind of a mix of all these things. The presence and absence of fire, whether you're in a fire refuge or in a fire-exposed landscape, that also affects your growth. And where you are on the planet. If you're near the equator, you've got very kind of limited seasonal variability. If you're at the poles, it's quite an extreme seasonal variability. In terms of the biotic component, we've got plant, you've got a competition amongst plants. So that could be intraspecific within species or interspecific between species. Should be very familiar with those terms. There's also your plant-animal interactions. And plant-animal interactions isn't just grazers eating grass or browsers eating plants. There's also, so that those do affect plant growth, but beyond just growth, there is like seed dispersal, which is kind of future growth. So whether the animals are being good dispersal agents for the growth to allow for germination and growth of your seeds. Importantly, there's also plant microbes. And this is another field which we know very, very little about. An example is many orchids. Their seeds are very tiny and they don't have enough energy. This applies to many orchid species. The seeds are so small that they don't have enough energy to produce their own roots. So when they germinate, they need to germinate and form a symbiosis with the fungi. And the fungal strands act as roots, shunting water to the seed. And as it grows, it then produces leaves, and then a symbiotic relationship forms between the fungi and the seeds, where the seedling produces photosynthate for the fungi, and the fungi acts as its extended root network. And so you cannot get orchids to grow in a sterile environment without specific fungal strains. So that's just one example that's very clear cut, but we are not, in the last 5 years, I think we've realized to the degree that we don't understand these plant microbe interactions. There is a hypothesis that has been put forward that there is certain European forests have fungal networks which transport photosynthate between trees. And so if effectively, if one tree is struggling in a forest, if that tree falls, it creates a problem in the forest where the dynamics change in other species. It makes that localized area get warmer. It then affects other trees around it. So what will happen is that if one tree is battling, the idea is, and the hypothesis is that that there can be a nutrient transport to maintain that tree so that there's no forest gap. It's a very contentious theory with limited evidence, but there is one good study that suggests this might be happening, but we're not quite sure how or why the mechanisms are. But the fact that we don't understand the microbe interactions might explain why our restoration often fails, because we don't take microbes into account. Where was I going with this slide? Okay, so factors that affect growth in the location. We've got grassland up here. thicket down here, and Nama Karoo at the base. And this was actually that boundary I was talking to you about earlier, that I said I walked across it on numerous occasions and didn't realize that it was a geological boundary. This is shale down here, tail mounted sandstone up there. The shale makes it effectively drier, which means that the trees seem to be able to outcompete the grasses because they're the kind of slow and steady tortoises. They can hang in there in between the rain events and get a little bit, whereas grass needs quite an abundant. Remember, it's got that high productivity that it requires in the growing season, so you need a lot of water and warm temperatures. So it seems a bit weird. You'd think like grass should grow in the dry environment here. But my understanding of this system at the moment is that this is effectively drier because the clays hang onto the water. And so the tortoises, the slow-growing trees that can just invest a little bit each time, can shade out the grasses. And even where some thicket has been cleared and grass isn't being shaded out, you can see that the grass just doesn't make it on there. And you'll see in a wet year, some clumps will pop up. They're obviously from seed, but they quickly die and don't remain established. But thicket could grow up there and shade, but this grass dries out fairly often, it burns, and so you get fires commonly up there. And so the fire keeps the tree component out. What's going on down here? I've mentioned this before. It's a different environmental factor. So up there it's fire that's keeping thicket out. Down here it's your soils that are creating a drying, keeping your grasses out. Down here, which is also on the shales, you've got frost, minimum temperatures. Most of these species in the thicket evolved in a very warm period in the Earth's history, and they really can't handle frost. It's an evolutionary handicap that they have. So you don't get the trees out here. Why don't you get grasses here? Because it's still on shales, it's effectively dry. So you get Nama Karoo shrubs instead, arid system shrubs. It's really weird to have, this is a hyper-arid system vegetation that's growing next to a dwarf forest. And it's quite an astounding contrast. So, okay, moving on to another section. So you can see all these factors that are affecting growth, species, and the environment. There's going to be some repetition in this because I'm trying to get you to think about these things. So I do apologize if you do feel that I'm belaboring the point, but there is good reason for it. There are some laws and some theories that accompany how plant species interact with the environment. The first one is Lieberg's law of the minimum. So, a European theory, done in 1840, is called Lieberg's law, very popularly referred to as Lieberg's law, but actually it was developed by someone else. And Liebig, as always is the case in science, who was very good at advertising their ideas, gets all the credit. So even though it should be Sprengel's law of the minimum, but he didn't do a good job advertising it. And this was very much at the time that it was developed, was focusing on crop science. And that any yield of any crop is limited by soil, by the soil nutrient that is the least available. Do you notice here, crops? So no water issues with water. Usually, you're in an area that gets sufficient water, or if you're in an arid system, you have the ability to add water for irrigation. So you can see why water isn't added. So this is why there's a focus on soils in this theory. There is an update to this, because this is focused on soils and crops and whatnot, that the growth and distribution of any species is dependent on that one environmental factor that is critically in demand. And if there's a way to think of it, olden day barrel, multiple staves that form this minimum threshold as to how much water you can hold, and effectively whichever element, this is talking about soil, whichever element is the lowest in availability, that sets your maximum amount for your maximum biomass, for example, or maximum growth rates. You see that? So if zinc ends up being in high demand, suddenly maybe there's a massive zinc depletion and it drops down to over here, then all your water's going to fall out and suddenly your biomass or your rate of production goes down. So that's the law of the minimum. It's one single factor. It's actually quite difficult to find examples of Liebig's law of the minimum, but I think it is fairly common. Here's a paper looking at South African mesic grasslands. This was actually quite a neat study, a neat long-term study that they set up. Tim O'Connor and Richard Finn. And so what they were interested in is not necessarily biomass per se, but grassland communities and the effect of pH and nutrient availability. And so there's a UKZN have a research farm that they've been doing this, and the methods they looked at is that they went and they fertilized the soil. So they affected the soil pH, influence of fertilization on soil pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and the variation of plant traits, community composition, and species richness were examined in a 50-year grassland fertilization experiment. So they were continuously fertilizing grasses with different fertilizer types, and then seeing whether there was a prediction. So they looked at nutrient availability, organization, so it's not necessarily a single crop and the amount that it's producing, it's on the whole community. And these are the pH, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the main things. 50 years is impressive. You don't normally get experiments that run that long. And what they found was that there was definitely a hierarchy of what affected your annual net primary production, ANPP. And primary limiting nutrient was nitrogen was, so nitrogen set at the bottom of the stave. If your nitrogen was low, your ANPP was low, you increased nitrogen, and your productivity increased. But when phosphorus was added in combination with nitrogen, you got your maximum. So what it suggested is that you'd lift nitrogen above that stave, and now phosphorus became the limitation. You add phosphorus and the two together, they increased that water holding capacity of that barrel. And so there was this hierarchical, they're both limiting in a hierarchical fashion, and the interactive fashion is a minor component of what they found. And so supports, and they state Liebig's law of the minimum. Then, but Liebig's law of the minimum is limited. Yeah, one factor, and there's a minimum. What about if you have, say zinc is limiting, or let's think of another, maybe copper, okay? At very low levels, it's limiting, so it limits growth. What happens if you now have too much copper in the system? That's not covered by Lieberg's law of the minimum. What if you have too much of something, that you actually end up getting copper poisoning? So this is where Shelford developed this theory of tolerance to say, hang on, it's not all just about minimums. There's also a maximum. Yeah? So water is a classic one for some plant species. Not enough water, think of your pot plant, that you've either killed by not watering it or by overwatering it. Yeah? You can actually quite easily kill your pot plants by one or two ways. Question?
When you talk about nitrogen and phosphorus
Yeah.
in soil, is that changing the physical characteristic of soil to hold water?
So what they were doing in this experiment was a fertilization experiment. So they were taking different blocks and they were adding nitrogen by itself, phosphorus by itself, in combination, and to change the pH. Does that answer your question, or have I missed the point?
I'm just trying to ask, when you have an excess of ions in the soil, it causes stability of the soil and higher water retention, because you're talking about water.
Yeah, so there I was actually just talking about pouring water and whatnot, but you're taking it one level, you're taking it to the next level, that depending on your soil properties also affects water availability. So there's that upper factor that we need to take into account, and there's also another problem is that factors often work in concert rather than in isolation. And I think the point that you just raised talks about factors working in concert. So if you've got higher ions in the soil property, you can either effectively moisten the soil for a given soil moisture, or you can effectively dry the soil for a given soil moisture. When I say soil moisture, I just mean the percentage of water that's in that soil. But the plant availability, the water available to plants might vary depending on the property of the soil. So Shelford came up with this theory of tolerance, which is the organism's success is based on a complex set of conditions, and that each organism has a certain minimum, maximum, and optimum environmental factor or combination of factors that determines its success. It seems a bit obvious now, but in 1913 that was quite a thing, quite an idea to pitch. So here's just a representation. Previously we just had minimum staves. Here there's some environmental niche. We don't have units on these axes for these different things. Grazing intensity could be density of white rhinos, or Thompson's gazelle, or whatever it is. So you notice there's no units on this figure. It's a very abstract figure. Yeah, because there are no units to compare grazing intensity with light intensity. But the idea is that there's a lower and upper, and whatever is, say this is the maximum, so your maximum soil moisture is setting the limit here, higher soil moisture, this is the range that the species can occur in, and then so that affects its overall potential niche that the species can occur in. It's determined by whatever the minimum maximum and the maximum minimum. If that makes any sense. Should be. Then Ronald Good got involved, And previously, Shelford kind of really looked at, he did say they could act in concert, but he mostly focused on variables working in isolation. Whereas Ronald Good said that like almost all factors, like mostly are working in concert rather than isolation. It's not a single factor. And that, so if one factor is at its end of its range, or maybe another factor can step in and boost that, or control for that, or allow the species to occur beyond its kind of individual factor range, because it's working in concert. So two factors may work synergistically. So two things that are low abundance that would normally individually affect species, the distribution or the occurrence of the species, when they're put together, they can make it a very optimal environment for that species. So it's not a case of 1 + 1 = 2. 1 + 1 could equal a much higher optimum for that species. And so the updated definition is that each and every species is able to exist and reproduce successfully only within a definite range of environmental conditions. So that is suitably vague to fit just about any box you want to put through it. But that's the idea.